and Liss, and the name of the program is The Way to Go. I invite you to join me each week at this time as we explore places to go and things to do. Today's exploration is into a world that I never knew existed. There is a marvelous exhibit at the Katonah Museum, that great museum that I've talked about before on this program. And it's called Friends and Family, but it really takes us into the life and times and friends and art of Florine Stettheimer. And with me today is the curator of that exhibit, who is going to give us her own insights on why and how. Her name is Barbara Bloemink. You told me that I have trouble with your name, but that's okay. And I'm so glad that you could join us. You're the curator of this exhibit.
Yes.
And who is this Florine Stettheimer, and why an exhibit by her at the Katonah Museum?
Well, why at the Katonah Museum? I think because they had the foresight to want to do it. They knew about her. Who was she? I think she's one of the great undiscovered treasures of American art history, certainly 20th century art history. And I think it's about time we focused more attention and rediscovered her.
By saying rediscovered her, has she been discovered before?
In little bits. She was actually very well known in the 1920s and the 30s, was in every major of the first Whitney exhibitions, all the early biennials, all the major Carnegie Internationals. If there was a big exhibition going on in the United States from 1918 to about 1942, she was in it. She and Georgia O'Keeffe were considered the two preeminent women artists of the time. But after she died in 1946, even though the Museum of Modern Art held a big retrospective of her work that major friends like Marcel Duchamp organized, her work pretty much literally went underground and was discovered by some feminist art historians in the 70s and people like Andy Warhol, artists. But she's sort of a cult figure among contemporary artists, and the rest of us don't know who she is.
What's unique about her work?
It's totally different from what we've been taught or what our history books tell us modernism looks like, because it's the world of the 20s and the 30s in New York seen through a very ironic feminine sensibility, which is very different from the way we usually think of modernism as having very clean compositions with a single image, very spare. Hers are cluttered with putti and people and flowers and lace, but they're the best images to give you a sense of what New York City was like, its sounds, its sights in the 20s and the 30s of any artist.
Let's just give a small indication of one of her piece of work. This is the cover of the catalog. Right,
that's the painting Soiree that's in the exhibition.
And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a few minutes, but you get a feeling from this painting on her work. What is the style?
It's her own idiosyncratic style. She had trained at the Art Students League in Munich and Paris and learned a very traditional way of painting. But in 1914, when she came back and settled in the United States, along with many artists and writers because of the outbreak of war in Europe, she decided that America was going to be the country of the 20th century and that it needed its own new art style. So she went back through art history and kind of taught herself a new way of painting and drawing, of using pure color right out of the tube, of painting almost like a child. There was a real interest in children's art and folk art at the time, and little bits of Matisse and little bits of Persian miniatures, and then there are little echoes of famous old master paintings in all of her works.
You say came back to the United States, and some of the background about her and her family might be of interest here.
Well, she was part of a very prominent group of people, German Jewish families living in New York, the Guggenheims, the Seligmans, the Beers, and at a very young age, she, her mother, and her four siblings went to Europe where they had relatives, and they basically stayed there for the first 40 years of her life. And she consistently looked at art. She trained her eye the way most traditional male painters, by doing the grand tour in Europe, by just staring at old master paintings, trained themselves in connoisseurship. That's what she did. She really spent hours and weeks and months of her life in all the museums in Europe looking and learning.
And then came back to the United States.
Totally changed.
And changed it completely.
Right.
And so she lived in this very famous apartment house in Manhattan.
Yeah, the Alwyn Court.
The Alwyn Court.
Which is very much like her painting style with salamanders on the outside. It's a Frances First style. And one of her friends, Carl van Vechten, who's figured in this exhibition, called it the Stettheimer Chateau because it so fits her style.
Mm-hmm. And what happened there?
Well, that's what makes it so interesting. In the 20s, there were 4 or 5 so-called art circles or salons. The Ahrensbergs had one, Gertrude Stein had one in Paris with Alice Toklas, and the Stettheimers, people didn't so much go out on dates for entertainment. They came to each other's homes to be entertaining and witty with each other. And so she would gather with her 2 sisters and her mother the most interesting and the most eccentric writers, speakers, poets, painters, sculptors of the time. And she and her sisters would come out with this wonderful 5-course menu, and everyone from Cecil Beaton to H.L. Mencken to Leo Stein, Ellie Nodelman, Carl van Vechten would all meet, like in soiree, and sit around and discuss art, discuss ideas. They're very conscious that they were the new avant-garde.
And this exhibition not only shows her work, but also reflects some of the people who are in her circle.
Well, that's the point of it, and I think that's what's so exciting is normally it was one thing to just say this is an under-recognized artist, let's pay attention to her. What we tried to do at Katonah is to put her work in the context with all of her friends and concentrate on portraiture because they were all making portraits of each other in different media. So we have drawings of Florine by her friend Marcel Duchamp, then we have paintings of Marcel by Florine. Then we have a musical portrait of Florine by the composer Virgil Thompson, who I was lucky enough to interview about her before he died. We have every kind of portrait of this little insular group. We have photographs of the people she was painting so that you can see how uncanny some of her likenesses are. How
did you discover her?
I was sitting and reading some Georgia O'Keeffe letters at the Yale University Library, and I read this very funny letter where O'Keeffe was complaining about her husband and how impossible men were, and she was writing it to Florine Stettheimer, so I wondered who was this woman. And then I saw a few of the paintings and burst out laughing, and I thought, if I have to spend a long part of my life writing a dissertation, I'd like to write it on someone who was funny. And I think then I read a poem that she wrote that said, "The world is full of strange people. They are very strange. I'm never going to know them, which I find easy to arrange." And I decided she'd be the perfect person to work on.
Talk about strange people. Let's go back to this color illustration. And there are quite a few people in this who you can point out who are really part of her salon, I
Exactly.
suppose.
Well, let's see. We have Albert Glees and Gaston Lachaise, a major French painter and sculptor who were in New York at the time, and their wives. Avery Hopwood, who wrote a play, Fair and Warmer, that was the hottest thing in Broadway, and he sort of introduced the Gold Diggers to Broadway musicals. Leo Stein, who was Gertrude Stein's brother, and he's holding a little hearing aid there because he was hard of hearing. You've got Isabelle Lachaise sitting back here, who's the wife of Gaston. Then you've got Florine, and a harlequin figure is only partially shown who might be either Marcel Duchamp or Nijinsky, the dancer who she saw dancing in 1910 in Paris.
What about that painting on the wall?
Now that's wonderful because this whole painting, Florine, is showing you the typical drawing room scene in her family apartment with all of her friends gathered around. But everyone is looking at this painting that you could only see the back of the canvas, which is a reference to a Velázquez painting. And on the back wall, there's a large painting of a nude woman holding a flower bouquet that looks a little bit like Manet's outrageous painting Olympia that was such a scandal when it was first exhibited. In fact, what no one, even of her friends, realized, and we're going to have the actual painting in the Katonah show, that's a self-portrait of Florine, and she's making fun of the whole art world there by showing herself naked, holding flowers, and yet everyone is looking away from her except one woman here. Mrs. Lachaise suddenly recognizes that the features are Florine's, and she's throwing her hand up to her chest in astonishment. So Florine, meanwhile, is staring out at the viewer and wondering whether we catch the joke. So it's all about wit and subtlety.
Now, is this an interpretation that you gathered, or is this an interpretation that someone else said, what
See,
what
no
happened?
one's written about her work
Uh-huh.
this way. So that, yes, the faults are all mine. I basically have read all of these things and read her diaries and correspondence, and I believe my readings stem from familiarity of looking. But because of the way this exhibition, I think it's a very radical way of doing an exhibition now, is not just to show the work, but to try and show the context.
Are these large paintings?
Some are very large. They range from 12 by 14 to 50 by 60 inches. And she also often will design wide gilded frames around them.
And they're very colorful, aren't they?
Very colorful. It's just an explosion of color. But so was the work of Charles Demuth at the time, her friend O'Keeffe at the time. I mean, this was a period where they were using a lot of pure color.
Why don't we look some more into some of the illustrations and perhaps show them, and that would certainly point out what we're talking about. Now, while we're finding the photos here, is there any particular way that these paintings are shown or arranged, and then a time sequence in?
Yes, we like exhibitions. I think a good exhibition should have somewhat of a storyline. And that means that we have laid this out more or less in a chronologic manner. And it goes from about 1916 to about 1942. But what we've also done is when you get to a painting like this one, of Carl van Vechten, who was not only a photographer and a great novelist, you've got a stack of his novels here under his cat, but he pretty much was one of the people responsible for the Harlem Renaissance. He was very instrumental in bringing African-American culture downtown. Next to this portrait by Florine, we have photographs of Van Vechten, copies of Van Vechten's books, lots of little clues so that you're looking at the portrait in the exhibition, you can also see all of this other material, and it becomes a little bit like a detective story. You read the paintings like a text.
Mm-hmm. And what about this other
Well, that's wonderful because it took place in Bedford Hills in Westchester. Every summer, the Stettheimers would rent a house in Tarrytown or Bedford Hills or Larchmont, the four women, three sisters and the mother, and they would invite all their friends out to spend the day in the country. And in this case, this was the Robert Hughes estate in Bedford Hills, and you've got Marcel Duchamp looking at the pot that's cooking here to see what could be cooking. And you've got the sculptor Ellie Nodelman, who lived in Riverdale, flirting with Florine's sister Eddie. And Florine is always the observer. She's the artist, always detached. And so she's sitting aside on a corner while her sister Carrie prepares a picnic. So they're all portraits, but they're portraits within an identifiable location. Mm-hmm. So they're like conversation pieces.
This whole process of curating, what is involved? It seems to me that it's discovery, mm-hmm. It's being a scholar, mm-hmm. It's being a detective.
A little bit. That's why it's so interesting.
And where does it all start? How does an exhibit start?
I think it starts with the passion of the curator. You see something, you see an object or a group of objects, and you get extremely excited, and you decide you really want to spend some time working and looking on them. Once you have a really clear idea, and you've spent time looking, and you have a theme or something to build an exhibition around, you either approach the institution you work for as a curator or an outside institution. In this case, Katonah Museum, I have many friends there who knew I was working on Stettheimer, and they contacted me and said, is there an exhibition you'd like to do related to Stettheimer? And I said, well, her portraits and those of her friends of the time make a very nice, discreet grouping. Let's do that. And they were wonderfully supportive. And two people, Athena Kimball and Catherine Moore from the Katonah Museum, became kind of a collaborative team with me. And we spent the last 2 years doing all the minutiae necessary to track down the paintings, put together a checklist, writing the essay, and then kind of plan an installation that will give people coming through some sense of what it was like to live then. Because we have this funny problem that we always think that we are the most interesting era, the one we're in now. But the 1920s and 30s in New York were fascinating.
So this is more than an exhibit of the work of this artist,
right? Very
and
much
her
so.
friends. It's more of a comment on this avant-garde time.
Exactly, because it was there for a brief moment. This was the last time that the avant-garde tended to be kind of the elite artists. After that, when the war broke out, all of this work kind of disappeared or went underground. Abstract Expressionist came out, and that was much more the individual artist, the masculine artist expressing bold movements. This was a period of high style, irony, humor, and no one's work catches it as well as Stettheimer's.
What kind of influences that all of these creative people have on each other, working together, socializing together?
Well, that's what the reciprocity, the idea that they were very interested in who they were, notions of identity. We're the avant-garde. They were very clear. Okay, so what does that mean? Who are we? That's why this whole group of people turned to portraiture, because they were seeking to find out who they were and identify themselves and give themselves a public image. So as I said, they all made portraits of each other. Gertrude Stein began it by writing word portraits of her friends. And the idea being that you didn't try to capture what the person looked like. You captured their insides, their character, their personality. And so a lot of these portraits are not figurative. They're not what you expect a straight-on portrait. They're mechanical parts. They're written words that don't seem to mean anything. They're funny. In some of Florine's portraits, she has the same person repeated 5 times in a single composition because, in this case, the art critic Henry McBride had many interests in his life. So she showed each part of the painting has him, one in overalls, one in a top hat, one judging a tennis match.
But she wasn't as famous as some of the people who were part of her group. Did that bother her?
At the time, she was.
Oh, she was.
Absolutely. See, that's what I think we forget. During her lifetime, she was at least as well known, say, as Georgia O'Keeffe. The difference is that Georgia O'Keeffe, who knew each other, they knew each other very well. Georgia O'Keeffe's husband was an art dealer, Alfred Stieglitz, and we've got a wonderful portrait of Stieglitz in his gallery, painted by Florine in the exhibition. He spent most of his mature life promoting O'Keeffe's work, selling it, making sure it got seen, making sure she got commissions. Florine painted for herself.
Uh-huh. As a matter of fact, I read somewhere that she wanted her paintings to be destroyed.
Rather than have them go on the crass art market. Yes, she told her lawyer on her deathbed, which is very ill with cancer, that she would like to have all of her paintings destroyed. But luckily, her lawyer and her sister Eddie, who survived her, didn't do that. They gave them to major museums across the country. The problem is they went into the museum basements, and until shows like this exhibition at Katonah, they've been sitting in the basements waiting.
How did you find them?
A lot of detective work, a lot of good friends. There are a lot of Stettheimer fans, when you start looking, that you start finding, who've put me in touch with very nice people who put me in touch. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has 4 of the major Stettheimers. The Museum of Modern Art has 2. The Brooklyn Museum has a terrific one.
In their basements or on exhibit?
Well, they're starting, since I've been working on her, they're starting to come on view. The Metropolitan Museum has had theirs on view for a couple years now because their curator is very fond of Stettheimer, William Lieberman. So, again, it's like a little cult figure. She's starting to really come back. In every book on women artists now that you pick up, suddenly she's in there.
You keep referring to women, and of course, someone has said that this is the year of the woman
at the Katonah Museum. Exactly.
And there are also other exhibits at the museum at the same time with the Stettheimer. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. At the same time, concurrently, there's an exhibition, The Photographic Portrait in America, that was organized by the Chrysler Museum, and that's going to show a lot of the same people that are in Florine's paintings in portraits, and so it's a wonderful combination between portraits that are flat-out photographs reproducing what someone looks like, and these avant-garde portraits that often don't look anything like the person looked. And then the third show that's going on at Katonah at the same time is Grace Knowlton, who is a wonderful sculptor who I think has been under-recognized for years. So she's going to be with her work out in the Sculpture Garden, which is, as you know, fabulous.
Yes, it's a great garden. As a matter of fact, the last exhibit there, you curated that too, didn't you?
Well, there was an exhibition last summer called Benchmarks that we had a lot of fun with, because the idea was to have artwork that you could actually sit on. So Katonah is wonderful about trying to open our minds as to what an art exhibition can be. so that we don't always do the same sort of thing. They're very willing to be experimental and try these things, like this exhibition.
And where is it going to lead? What's going to happen with Florine Stettheimer as a result of this exhibit?
Well, along with this, I just finished a 13-chapter dissertation on her that got bound and sent off to Yale this week, which will result in a book, which is a full overview of her life. And I'm negotiating and talking with a number of major museums about the idea of doing a full retrospective, because her major friends of the time, Marston Hartley, Charles Demuth, Georgia O'Keeffe, have all had major retrospectives. She's the one missing.
Not only has there not been a major retrospective, has there been much written about her?
Actually, quite little. And nothing's been written about her stage designs, her ballet designs, her furniture that she designed, the frames that she designed. There were multiple levels to this woman that people just aren't aware of, and that's why I'm hoping that an eventual retrospective will let us show that.
But all of this, or much of this, happened later in her life, didn't it?
No, it was sort of happening concurrent. See, the thing is that the first 40 years in Europe, she was very interested in the ballet russe, in theatrical design. She designed a ballet in 1910 that was very avant-garde that she was hoping Nijinsky would dance in. And in Europe, there was a sense that the artist who designed a desk or a beautiful gilded mirror was an artist, just like a painter. There wasn't this craft, fine art differentiation. And so she and many of her colleagues felt the artist should transform everything in their environment. And unfortunately, I think, when they came to the United States, by about the 30s, it became very separated into the decorative arts and the fine arts. But in this period, many of these artists were working in all kinds of media, all at the same time.
So again, in her life, she painted, and she died in her 70s?
Yes.
And she painted quite a bit when she was older, did she?
Well, that's part of the reason I think she's so under-recognized, because her major paintings don't date until she was about between 45 and 70 years old. And it's very hard for us to imagine somehow in our society an older woman being ironic, funny, a little sexy, startling, and avant-garde. We sort of think women need to be sweet little old ladies, and she absolutely refused. She and her sisters wore red wigs. They wore spangled dresses. They loved to dress up. They enjoyed themselves, and they thought of themselves as young maidens right until their death.
Now, would you say that her work had any influence on artists who followed? Was she known? Did she set any patterns that others studied? Or did she just disappear?
She partly disappeared, but one of the things that I've been studying recently is if you look at Saturday Evening Post covers from the 40s and the 50s, or the illustrators, her style went underground and shows up in popular illustration. And then by the time you get to Warhol and people working today like William Wegman, Hollis Ziegler, Robert Kirshner, they all claim Florine Stettheimer influenced them.
So while she may not be well known to the public in general, she certainly is well known within the art world,
circles. Yes,
the art world.
Yes.
And what else is happening? You as a curator, are you always looking in new directions to find things? You discovered her. She always was there, but nobody has gone into Florine's life and her work as you have. Are there other artists out there who
well, it's
you're
not
pursuing?
Artists so much. I think it's the way we're taught art history. Is that we've all been traditionally taught one kind of art history, which is white, upper middle class, Western art history. But there are all of these other kinds that are starting to come out now. Latino art, African American art, art by women, art by people with different sexual preference. And what I'm interested in is kind of exploding the boundaries of what is significant artwork and making us re-look at. And one of the things Florine does is she completely explodes the traditional definition of modernism.
I would think that getting to know someone, this is 10 or 12 years that you've been interested in her. I would think that this would change your life a great deal, becoming so involved with another person.
I think you talk to anyone who's written a biography and spent a long time with a person, you go through stages where you're infatuated with them, then you dislike them, and then you have to separate yourself. And I'm very lucky that I have a wonderful 94-year-old grandmother who was an artist from age 17, was very independent, was very involved in the art scene in Europe and New York, who I think has allowed me to appreciate Florine.
In what way?
In a way that you can be a wonderful, outspoken, ironic older woman and have a good time and be truly, Stettheimer was completely dedicated to her artwork and being a professional artist. She wasn't a dilettante. She wasn't just some eccentric old lady. She really saw herself as a professional, serious artist. And I think that's causing us to relook at how we look at women, at older people, at creativity. And that's all part of this reevaluation that I'm interested in doing.
Are you saying that women are underrated as artists? Is that what
I think most women don't have the time to do art because they are basically often raising children and families, and so they don't have free time for themselves until they are in their 40s and 50s very often. Florine and her sisters, because they were wealthy and they chose never to marry, they had suitors. Late in their life, one of the sisters said at a dinner party, "We may be virgins, but we know the facts of life." They were very aware, but they didn't want to be encumbered by husbands or children. They wanted to be dedicated to their work. So one sister, Florine, was a painter. She wrote wonderful poetry. Another sister got a PhD in philosophy in Freiburg, Germany. They're very serious, scholarly, bright women.
One of the things about going to see an exhibit is you can just walk and see the exhibit and appreciate the art.
Right.
But then knowing more about what went behind it, as you have opened up for us our eyes to who Florine was and the world that she lived in, I think will enhance the enjoyment of the exhibit at the Katonah Museum for everybody who comes to see it, because it's more than just paintings. It's a time of life. It's the life of a woman. It's the life of the times, I suppose, right, and other artists who existed at that time. And I thank you very much for coming here today and really giving us this insight, which is valuable to us. And our guest today has been Barbara Bloemink, who is the curator of the exhibit on Florine Stettheimer, which is at the Katonah Museum. It's a wonderful museum. This is a wonderful exhibit. It's there through the end of November. I urge you to make a special trip and see it. I'm Norman Liss. The name of the program is The Way to Go. Until next week at this same time, enjoy yourself.